They said no one came back from Griffith's Crossing. But Wyatt Blackthorne wasn't just anyone, and he had a score to settle. As his horse crested the ridge, the ghost town spread below him like a wound that had never healed. Wind tore through the empty streets, scattering dust and forgotten names, and somewhere beneath the cracked earth, the truth was waiting buried, but not dead, as the man neared. The old buildings began to creak in the wind, some barely standing, others leaning as if they might collapse at any moment. The town, forsaken by time and the people who once called it home, had become little more than a collection of relics. It was a place where secrets buried long ago were still whispering beneath the cracked streets. Wyatt Blackthorne, a name that carried as much weight as the dust that filled the air, reined in his horse and dismounted slowly. His boots met the ground with a thud that echoed faintly in the silence. He adjusted his worn-out hat, pulling it lower to shield his eyes from the biting wind. His face, rugged and scarred by years of hardship, revealed nothing about the man he had once been or the life he had left behind. For years, he had been drifting from town to town, job to job, a man with no home, no future, a soldier once, now a ghost. Griffith's Crossing was just another stop, another place where he could try to put the pieces of his life back together, if such a thing was even possible. But there was something about this place that felt different, something that gnawed at him from the moment he laid eyes on it. Maybe it was the look of the old town, its cracked facades and empty windows staring back at him like forgotten memories. Or maybe it was the sense that he wasn't just passing through this time, that this place had a story to tell him, whether he was ready for it or not. He hitched his horse by the old post office and made his way toward the saloon. The rickety structure creaked as he pushed the door open, the smell of stale whiskey and burnt tobacco greeting him like an old friend. The few souls who were left in Griffith's Crossing gathered here, their faces as hard as the land that surrounded them. They looked up briefly as Wyatt entered, their eyes lingering for a moment too long before they went back to their quiet conversations. The bartender, a grizzled man with a thick mustache and dark eyes that had seen too much, nodded to him. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. Wyatt ordered whiskey. The bartender poured it without a word, sliding the glass across the counter. The glass was scratched, the liquid swirling in its depths like the ghosts of the past. Wyatt took a slow sip, the burn spreading down his throat, and looked around the room. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional cough or the scrape of a chair leg on the wooden floor. He noticed a man sitting at the back of the saloon, his back to the wall, eyes trained on Wyatt. He wore a black hat and a long coat that made him look as if he belonged in a different time, a time when men like him didn't ask questions. They just made decisions. Wyatt's instincts kicked in, and he felt the pull of something dangerous, something familiar. It wasn't just the man's presence, but the weight of the room that seemed to settle on him. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, Wyatt wondered if his arrival had stirred up something that had been lying dormant in Griffith's Crossing for far too long. He took another drink and decided to approach the man. The walk to the back was slow, deliberate, as he reached the table. The man didn't acknowledge him at first, his gaze never leaving the window. Wyatt stood there for a moment, waiting. Finally, the man spoke. "You've come a long way for a drink," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. He was younger than Wyatt had expected, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen more than his fair share of the world's darkness. "I've come a long way for more than that," Wyatt replied, his voice just as measured. "Name's Blackthorn." The man looked at him then, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Roan Pike," he said, his tone shifting, as if the name held more weight than it appeared. He studied Wyatt for a moment, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Wyatt did as he was told, sitting with his back straight, every muscle tense. Pike was no ordinary man. That much was clear. There was something in his presence that made Wyatt uneasy, an unspoken authority, like a shadow that loomed over the town. Pike took a long drag from his cigar and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling. "Griffith's Crossing isn't much these days," he said. "We don't get many travelers, and we don't take kindly to strangers asking too many questions." His eyes bored into Wyatt's. "So you'd do well to keep your distance." Wyatt didn't flinch. "I'm not here to stir things up," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just looking for work." Pike grunted. "Work's scarce around here, but you're welcome to try." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never wavering. "Just know, if you start digging too deep, you might find things you don't want to know." Wyatt stared back at him, the weight of the words settling in his chest. It wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge he knew he couldn't ignore. He finished his drink, stood up, and walked toward the door. But before he stepped outside, he paused, his hand resting on the weathered frame. "I've got a feeling," he said, his voice soft, almost to himself. "This town's got more buried than just dust." The door swung open with a groan, and Wyatt stepped back into the fading light of the evening. As he walked away from the saloon, his boots kicking up the dry earth, he couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival in Griffith's Crossing wasn't by chance. Something had brought him here, and this time, it came with a name written in blood. As Wyatt made his way down the dusty road, his thoughts began to drift, his mind playing over the brief exchange with Pike. There was something about the man's warning, something in the way he had looked at him that told Wyatt this town was hiding more than it let on. And that was just the kind of thing Wyatt had spent years searching for. Not peace, not solace, but the truth. He could feel it in the air, thick with secrets. The town, like him, was running from something, and just like every place he had ever been, there was something waiting to be uncovered. He couldn't stop now. He wouldn't stop. The wind blew harder as night fell, and Wyatt pulled his collar up to shield his neck from the chill. He didn't know what was waiting for him in Griffith's Crossing, but he was certain of one thing: it wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. As he turns to leave, a man on horseback rides into town, Sheriff Roan Pike. His gaze falls on Wyatt, and without a word, Pike dismounts, locking eyes with him. The tension between the two men is palpable, and it's clear that their paths are about to cross in a way neither is prepared for. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a purple haze over Griffith's Crossing. A few townsfolk gathered around a campfire, their faces obscured in shadow. They spoke in low, cautious voices, as if afraid the night itself might overhear. The remnants of the town, the broken-down church, the abandoned homes seemed to lean into the darkness as if hiding from the truth. And in that twilight hour, when everything seemed still, the silence of the town spoke louder than any word could. Wyatt Blackthorn stood at the edge of the street, watching the shadows stretch long across the dusty earth. He had barely been in town for a full day, yet already the weight of its emptiness pressed down on him. The place felt abandoned in more ways than one, not just the buildings, but the people too. They were here, yes, but they weren't truly living, They had stopped some time ago, perhaps when the town had given up on hope. He felt it in his bones, this unspoken heaviness. But then, there was also something else, a curiosity, gnawing at him, pulling him toward the heart of the town. The people here were silent, but they were not without story. He could feel it, just beneath the surface. And if there was one thing Wyatt had learned, it was that silence often hid the loudest of truths. The wind blew softly through the town, rattling the loose shutters on the buildings and carrying the scent of desert sagebrush through the streets. Wyatt adjusted his hat, tightening the brim as he made his way toward the old post office. The structure had seen better days, the faded paint peeling away like skin from a sun-baked rock. The windows were caked with dirt, and the door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of old paper and ink lingered in the corners. The desk, once a place of communication, now stood empty, its wood worn and cracked by years of neglect. Wyatt stepped further into the room, his boots crunching softly on the ground as he ran his hand over the surface of the desk. He could almost feel the weight of the history that had passed through this place. Letters, news, hopes, dreams. But now, it was all just forgotten. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the remnants of the town. There was a quiet desperation in the air, as if the land itself had been drained of its life. The people were here, but they had all but disappeared, their spirits lost to time. Wyatt's eyes narrowed as his thoughts wandered back to Sheriff Roan Pike. The man's warning still echoed in his mind, and Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Pike's presence than mere coincidence. It wasn't just the sheriff, it was the entire town. There was a secret here, buried deep beneath the dust and the forgotten memories, and Wyatt was starting to think he might be the one to unearth it. The sound of footsteps outside the post office drew his attention. He walked to the window, peering through the dirty glass. A woman was approaching, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. She moved with purpose, a slow, deliberate stride that suggested a quiet strength. She wore a faded apron and a bonnet that obscured most of her face. But there was something about the way she carried herself that told Wyatt she was not someone to be underestimated. He stepped back from the window just as she reached the door. She paused, her hand resting on the handle, as if she was unsure whether to enter. Wyatt straightened, watching her. His curiosity piqued. The door creaked as she opened it. Stepping inside without a word, she glanced at him, her eyes briefly meeting his, but she didn't speak. Instead, she moved past him, her presence filling the room with a quiet intensity. The woman made her way to the back of the post office, where a small counter stood, and began to rummage through a stack of old letters. The faint sound of paper rustling filled the silence. Wyatt watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. "You're Josie." "Aren't you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She froze, her hand stilling over the letters. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were a pale blue, distant and unreadable, but there was something else in them, a flicker of recognition, of something deeper that Wyatt couldn't quite place. "Yes," she replied softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Josie Hargrove." Wyatt nodded, taking a step closer. "I'm Wyatt Blackthorne," he said, his gaze lingering on her face. "I'm new around here." Josie gave a small nod, but her eyes never left his. "I know who you are," she said quietly. her voice tinged with something Wyatt couldn't quite define. "What brings you to Griffith's Crossing?" Wyatt hesitated for a moment, the weight of her question sinking in. "Looking for work," he said. His answer simple, but something in the way he said it made it clear that there was more to it. And maybe a bit of peace. Josie studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she turned back to the counter, continuing to sort through the letters as if nothing had happened. Wyatt remained still for a moment, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken words. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that Josie knew more about this town than she let on. Her quiet demeanor, the way she seemed to keep her distance from everyone, spoke of someone who had seen too much, someone who carried a burden that others couldn't even begin to understand. After a moment, Josie spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Griffith's Crossing isn't the kind of place you just pass through," she said, her tone carrying a weight of experience. "People come here to hide, or to escape, and sometimes they find more than they bargained for." Wyatt nodded slowly, sensing that there was a story hidden in her words. But before he could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside the building. Both of them turned, their attention drawn to the sound. The door to the post office slammed open, and Sheriff Pike entered, his heavy boots thudding against the floor as he moved toward the counter. His eyes locked on Wyatt, his gaze hard and calculating. "I warned you, Blackthorn," Pike said, his voice low and filled with an edge of menace. "You've started asking questions, and that's something people around here don't take kindly to. You best turn around and leave while you still can." Wyatt stood his ground, meeting the sheriff's cold stare with one of his own. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said evenly, though the weight of Pike's threat hung heavily in the air. "I'm just trying to understand this town." Pike's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "There's nothing to understand," he said, his voice quiet but forceful. "Some things are better left buried." Wyatt didn't flinch. "I'll be the judge of that." Pike's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. The sheriff took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You've been warned." "Blackthorn," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous. As the sheriff turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he added, his words hanging in the air like a final threat before he disappeared into the night. Wyatt turned his gaze back to Josie, who had been silently watching the exchange. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Wyatt saw a flicker of something in her expression, a mixture of fear and understanding, as if she knew exactly what was coming next. As Wyatt leaves the saloon, he notices a familiar face in the crowd, a man he recognizes from his past. The man, a former comrade in arms, walks toward Wyatt, but as their eyes meet, the man quickly turns and disappears into the shadows. Wyatt stands frozen, the sense of an unresolved chapter in his past gnawing at him. The sun had barely risen, but already the heat of the desert was beginning to settle in. Wyatt knelt by the old cemetery at the edge of town, his hand brushing over the weathered headstones. One in particular caught his eye, the name half erased by time and neglect. The stone was cracked, the letters faded, but Wyatt could just make out the name Jeremiah Pike. A cold shiver ran down his spine, his breath catching for a moment as the weight of the name settled over him. The last time he'd seen that name. It had been written in blood, and it had been the beginning of the end. The cemetery was quiet. Too quiet, with the desert heat pressing in around him, the occasional buzz of a cicada or the distant howls of coyotes were the only sounds that dared to break the oppressive silence. Wyatt's fingers lingered on the cracked stone, tracing the outline of the name, and his thoughts drifted back to his time in the war. The memories were still fresh, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He had known men like Jeremiah Pike, men who held power in their hands, but had little regard for what they broke in the process, men who never had to pay for their sins. The thought of Pike's name here, etched into a forgotten grave, was enough to spark something in Wyatt. There was a connection here, one that he couldn't quite place, but it was there, just beneath the surface. The past had a way of lingering, waiting for the right moment to rise to the surface. And in a town like Griffith's Crossing, secrets were like buried bones. They had a way of coming back to life. He stood, brushing the dust from his knees, and glanced around the cemetery once more. The place was long abandoned, the graves neglected by the townspeople who had long since moved on from whatever happened here. But Wyatt wasn't the kind to leave things alone, not when something was buried, and not when there was a connection waiting to be uncovered. As he started to turn away, he caught sight of something in the distance, a figure standing near the fence at the far side of the cemetery. A woman. Her back was to him, and she seemed to be waiting for something, her body tense as if she knew she was being watched. Wyatt didn't need to be a tracker to know she had been there for a while. The way she stood, the stillness in her posture, it was a calmness born of long practice. She turned slowly, her face coming into view just as he began to walk toward her. Josie Hargrove. She had an air about her that Wyatt hadn't quite figured out. Quiet, calculating. And yet something in the way she looked at him made him feel like she knew more about him than he did about her. She had that look, the look of someone who had seen too much, someone whose life had been shaped by things better left unsaid. "Wyatt Blackthorne," she said, her voice carrying a cool edge to it. She was standing next to a small grave, her eyes fixed on the inscription carved into the stone. "I thought you'd be here soon enough." Wyatt stopped a few paces away from her, his brow furrowing. "You've been here long." "Long enough," Josie replied, still not turning to face him. She bent down, her fingers tracing the letters on the gravestone. "Jeremiah Pike," she whispered, the name hanging in the air like a curse. "He was my grandfather." Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. The name felt like a lead weight in his chest, pulling him down. Pike. She had ties to him, to the man whose shadow seemed to stretch over this whole town. "Your grandfather?" Wyatt asked, his voice low, carefully measuring his words. "What happened to him?" Josie straightened up, her back to Wyatt now, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "He's buried here," she said quietly. "But nobody talks about it. Nobody ever has. He was a good man once, or at least, that's what they tell me. But something changed, something I don't think anyone was prepared for." Wyatt stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He was drawn to her words, to the mystery of the past that was beginning to unfurl like a map before him. "What happened?" "Josie." She shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't know," she said, her voice almost breaking. "All I know is that the town, the people here, they don't talk about it. They don't want to. They're scared, and they should be." Wyatt took another step toward her, his mind racing with questions. You know more than you're saying. She looked at him then, her eyes finally meeting his with a mixture of caution and resignation. I do. But you're not ready to hear it. Not yet. The air seemed to grow colder, the sun retreating behind the mountains as though to shield itself from the weight of the words hanging between them. Josie turned away from him again, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something just beyond reach. You've dug yourself into something deeper than you know. Wyatt, she said, her gaze flickering. If you keep going, someone's going to end up in that grave, and it might be you. Before Wyatt could respond, there was a noise from behind him, and he spun around, his instincts kicking in. A figure on horseback appeared in the distance, kicking up dust as he rode toward the cemetery. Wyatt's eyes narrowed. It was Sheriff Roan Pike, his figure silhouetted against the fading light of day. The sheriff's steely gaze locked onto Wyatt's. And for a moment, the two men stood across from each other, the tension thickening in the air. Pike's expression was unreadable, his face like stone, but the weight of his stare said it all. Josie, Pike said in a voice that carried over the distance. I've told you before. You stay away from him. Josie didn't flinch, her expression unchanged as she stood beside the grave. I'm not bothering anyone. Sheriff just paying respects. Pike dismounted with a fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He took a step forward, his eyes still fixed on Wyatt. This town doesn't need strangers stirring up old ghosts, he said, his voice colder than the night air settling around them. And that's all I'm going to say about it. Wyatt didn't back down. I'm not here to stir up ghosts, Pike. I'm just trying to understand what's been buried here. Pike's lip curled into a faint sneer, but his eyes flickered to Josie for a moment before returning to Wyatt. You keep digging. Blackthorn, he warned, his voice barely above a growl, and you'll find more than you ever wanted to know. Josie stepped forward then, her hand brushing against Wyatt's arm as she spoke softly, but firmly, her voice steady. He's right. Wyatt. Some things are better left buried. But Wyatt wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Pike, who stood motionless, the weight of years of silence hanging around him like a cloud. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Wyatt's voice cut through the air, low and steady, as he turned to Josie. I'm not afraid of the past. Josie's eyes flickered with something fear, or perhaps resignation, but she didn't argue. She knew better than anyone that the past had a way of catching up with you, whether you wanted it to or not. As Wyatt reads the final lines of the letter, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel echoes behind him. He turns to find Sheriff Roan Pike standing in the cemetery, his cold gaze fixed firmly on Wyatt. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the old sheriff's office, casting long, thin beams across the cracked wooden floor. Wyatt Blackthorn sat at a table, his hands resting on a yellowed map. As the town of Griffith's Crossing seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the occasional rattle of a distant wagon, the town, still buried under layers of time and neglect, looked as though it had long forgotten the meaning of peace. Yet, something in the air had shifted, as if the dust that had settled on everything was finally ready to move. Wyatt's finger traced a line on the map, following the winding paths that had once been the lifeblood of Griffith's Crossing old trails, forgotten roads, places that had seen the rise and fall of men and dreams. His mind, however, was on the conversation he'd had with Josie the day before, her cryptic words about the past, about Jeremiah Pike, kept gnawing at him. And now. The sheriff's warning echoed in his ears, a cold reminder that some things were better left untouched. Yet Wyatt couldn't walk away. Not now. He was too deep into this town's history, too tangled in its secrets, and the sheriff's warnings only served to stir the curiosity that had been with him for as long as he could remember. There was something hidden here, something that had been buried, and if Wyatt had to dig through the whole town to find it, then so be it. The door of the sheriff's office creaked open, and Wyatt's gaze lifted to see the man who had been haunting the edges of his thoughts. Sheriff Roan Pike walked in, his boots scraping the floor as he closed the door behind him with deliberate force. His face was unreadable, his eyes as cold as the early morning air. Pike didn't speak at first. He just stood there, surveying the room as if weighing the man sitting before him. Wyatt didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. He knew it was only a matter of time before the sheriff came to make sure he stayed in line. He folded the map and set it aside, then slowly met Pike's gaze. "You've been asking questions," Pike said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge that sent a chill through the room. And that's never a good thing in a town like this. Wyatt didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the wood. "I'm not the one hiding things. Pike," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just trying to understand what happened here." Pike's lips twitched, a barely perceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He stepped closer to the desk, his eyes never leaving Wyatt's. "You don't understand," he said softly. "People around here don't like strangers, and they certainly don't like people digging into things that have been buried for years." Wyatt stood up slowly, meeting Pike's cold stare. "What are you so afraid of?" he asked. "What happened here?" "Sheriff." For a moment, Pike didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, his gaze unwavering, as though he were deciding whether to crush the man in front of him or let him dig his own grave. Finally, Pike sighed, his voice dropping even lower. "Some things are better left in the past." "Blackthorn," he said. "You're not going to like what you find." "I'll be the judge of that," Wyatt replied, his tone unwavering, without another word. Pike turned and walked toward the door, his boots echoing in the silence of the room. He stopped just before stepping outside and glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Keep digging, and you won't be sorry you'll be buried beside the rest of them." Wyatt watched him leave, the door slamming shut behind him. His mind was racing, the sheriff's warning hanging heavily in the air, but there was no turning back now. He wasn't here to back down. If there was something to be uncovered, he would find it, no matter the cost. The sound of a horse's hooves clopping against the hard-packed earth drifted through the window, drawing Wyatt's attention. He turned and walked to the window, peering out just as a rider approached the town. The rider slowed as he came closer, pulling up in front of the sheriff's office. The man was older, his face lined with years of sun and hardship, and his posture suggested a man who had seen too much. Wyatt's eyes narrowed as he watched the rider dismount, his gaze lingering on the figure. The man didn't speak. Instead, he removed his hat and walked into the sheriff's office. Wyatt knew this wasn't just another drifter. This man was someone who had a story, and Wyatt's instincts told him that this man's story was tied to the one he was trying to uncover. He opened the door just as the man stepped inside. The stranger looked up, his eyes meeting Wyatt's with a knowing look, as though he had expected him. Without waiting for an invitation, the man walked over to the desk and placed a folded letter in front of Wyatt. The paper was old, frayed at the edges, and the ink was faint, but the words were still legible. "You're digging into something you don't understand. the man said, his voice raspy. "I've been trying to forget it for years, but if you're going to keep at it, then you need to know what's in that letter. It's the truth, but it's not one you'll want to hear." Wyatt's hand hesitated over the letter, his mind racing. The man's words echoed in his ears. The truth. It was always the truth, buried deep beneath the dust and the lies, waiting to be found. And he was going to find it, even if it meant uncovering a past that no one in Griffith's Crossing wanted to remember. The stranger stood there for a moment, his eyes studying Wyatt, before turning and walking out of the office without another word. Wyatt watched him leave, his fingers brushing over the worn paper. He opened the letter slowly, each fold creaking under his touch. As he read the faded words, a chill ran through him. The letter spoke of betrayal, of a hidden fortune, and of Sheriff Rowan Pike's involvement in the town's downfall. It spoke of Jeremiah Pike, to a man who had once been a hero, only to become a villain in the eyes of the very people he had sworn to protect. Wyatt folded the letter carefully, his mind whirling with the implications of what he had just learned. Pike wasn't just a sheriff. He was a man tangled in a web of lies, and the past was about to catch up with him. Wyatt turned to leave the office, but just as he stepped into the street, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed behind him. A flicker of movement caught Wyatt's eye. Not Pike this time, but a young deputy watching from the shadows with Pike's badge in hand. Fear in his eyes. The deputy didn't speak, but his presence said enough. Wyatt stepped back, the weight of realization sinking in. Pike wasn't acting alone. There were others in this town who knew what was buried and were just as determined to keep it hidden. The noose wasn't just tightening around Wyatt. It had already started to close. The wind picked up, swirling sand in the street as Wyatt walked toward the old mine. The once proud entrance now stood half-collapsed, the ruins a stark reminder of the town's fall from grace, in the distance. He saw figures approaching, their outlines blurred by the heat of the desert sun. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the earth itself had grown tired of holding its secrets. Wyatt paused at the entrance to the mine, his boots grinding into the dry ground as he stood there, taking in the sight. The mine stood like a grave. Someone forgot to bury broken bones of timber jutting from the earth, whispering stories no one dared to tell. It wasn't just ruin he saw, it was a warning, etched into every splinter and stone, that whatever had been buried here never truly stayed silent. But it wasn't the mine itself that drew Wyatt here. It was the whispers he had overheard, the fragments of conversations that had slipped through the cracks in the town's fragile silence. There was something buried here, something hidden beneath the earth that had been kept from the town for too long. And Wyatt had made up his mind he would find it, no matter the cost. He stepped carefully into the darkness of the mine, his footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of rust and earth. The beams above creaked ominously, and the sound of his own breathing echoed in the silence as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. He could make out the outline of old mining equipment, abandoned and forgotten, scattered haphazardly along the walls. This place had been alive once, full of men working tirelessly to pull riches from the earth. Now, it was just another ghost of the past. Wyatt moved deeper into the mine, the weight of the silence pressing on him. Every step seemed to bring him closer to something, a truth, a memory, or perhaps something darker. The air grew colder as he ventured further, the shadows swallowing him whole. He could feel the walls of the mine closing in on him, but he wasn't about to turn back. Not now. After what felt like hours. He reached a narrow passageway at the far end of the mine. The walls here were slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, with jagged rocks jutting out from the ground. Wyatt felt his way along the walls, his hand brushing against the cold stone as he moved forward. At the end of the passage, he saw something a glimmer of metal, just barely visible in the low light. He bent down and picked it up, wiping the dust away to reveal a rusted old lantern. Its glass was cracked, and the brass frame was tarnished with age. But there was something familiar about it. As he held it in his hands, a memory stirred in the back of his mind, a flicker of something long forgotten. He couldn't quite place it, but it felt like a piece of the puzzle he had been chasing for days. Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness, a low rumble, like the sound of something heavy shifting deep within the earth. Wyatt froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the narrow beam of light. It was a man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The figure moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his boots scraping against the stone floor. Wyatt's hand instinctively went to his holster, but the man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the man said, his voice gravelly and low. "You're not going to find what you're looking for down here." Wyatt narrowed his eyes, studying the man. There was something in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself, that told Wyatt this wasn't just some drifter. This man knew something that Wyatt needed to hear. "I'm not looking for anything," Wyatt replied, his voice steady. "I'm just following a trail that leads me straight to the heart of this town's past." The man smirked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "You think you can just waltz in here and dig up all the bones this town's been trying to bury for years?" He took a step closer, his boots echoing in the silence. "You're playing with fire. Blackthorn. And the flames aren't just going to burn you." Wyatt stood his ground, the weight of the man's words settling over him like a thick fog. "I'm not afraid of the flames." The man laughed, but it wasn't a sound of amusement. It was dark, cold, like a predator's laugh before the kill. "No, you're not," he said, "but you should be. You don't know what you're dealing with." Wyatt's hand tightened on the lantern, the rusted metal biting into his palm. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile widened. "I'm the one who knows the truth," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the air around them. "And I'm the one who's been trying to keep it buried." Wyatt's mind raced as he tried to process the man's words. The truth, the buried past, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But they were still too scattered, too out of reach. The man stepped back into the shadows, his form disappearing into the darkness. "You should leave." "Blackthorn," he called out, his voice fading with each word. "Before it's too late." Wyatt stood there, staring into the blackness, the echo of the man's words ringing in his ears. He could feel the weight of something heavy pressing down on him, something that had been hidden for far too long. This town, Griffith's Crossing, had secrets, dark ones, and it seemed like everyone here was hiding something. Just as Wyatt turned to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He spun around, his hand reaching for his gun, but stopped when he saw who it was. The figure was tall, silhouetted against the fading light, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. It was Sheriff Roan Pike. Wyatt turned to leave the mine, but just as he stepped into the street, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed behind him. He spun around to find Sheriff Roan Pike standing in the doorway, his cold gaze fixed firmly on Wyatt. "You've worn out your welcome, Blackthorn," Pike growled. "You stay one more night in this town, and you'll find out what real trouble looks like." The sun had set, and the desert night crept in, colder than it should have been. Wyatt Blackthorn stood face to face with Sheriff Roan Pike in the heart of Griffith's Crossing. The town, as if sensing the finality of what was to come, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to break free. The low whistle of the wind rattled the windows of the old saloon, and the distant howl of a coyote punctuated the silence between the two men. This was it, the point of no return. No more warnings, no more half-truths. The past was about to be exposed, and neither man knew how it would end. Wyatt stood tall, his boots firmly planted in the dust, his face set in a grim expression. His hand was resting just above his holster, though he knew this wasn't a fight he could shoot his way out of. No, this was going to be something else. This was the reckoning. Pike had kept his secrets hidden for too long, and now the time had come to drag them into the light. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a tight, controlled smile. "I told you, Blackthorn," Pike said, his voice low, yet somehow carrying the authority of the land itself. "You don't belong here. You never did, and if you don't turn around and walk away now, you'll find out just how far that can go." Wyatt didn't flinch. He'd been through too much in his life to be intimidated by a man like Pike. He knew the sheriff's game control, fear, intimidation. But Wyatt wasn't the scared young soldier he used to be. He had seen the worst the world could offer, and he had survived. Now, standing in the shadow of Pike's cold, oppressive gaze, Wyatt realized that his quest wasn't just about finding the truth of Griffith's Crossing. It was about saving himself from the ghosts of his own past. "I'm not leaving," Wyatt said, his voice steady, a quiet fury burning behind his words. "Not until I understand what happened here, what you did." Pike's gaze hardened, and for a moment, the two men stood in silence. The town around them felt as though it had frozen, as if it, too, were waiting for the inevitable clash. Then, with a single, deliberate movement, Pike reached for his belt, his fingers brushing the handle of his revolver. Wyatt's hand went to his own gun, but something held him back. He wasn't going to draw first, not this time, not when it wasn't just a matter of bullets and violence. This time, it was about something deeper. "You think you know the truth?" Pike sneered, his voice rising, cutting through the stillness. "You think you've uncovered something you're just a fool, Blackthorn. You have no idea what you're messing with. You're digging in places that should have stayed buried, and you don't know how much you've already lost." Wyatt didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He kept his eyes locked on Pike's. The sheriff was a man who had lived with his lies for too long, and it was starting to show. The cool facade was slipping, the cracks beginning to show. "I know enough," Wyatt said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know about the mine, the treasure, the betrayal. I know what you did to my people, to your people, and I know you've been hiding the truth from everyone in this town for far too long." For a moment, Pike was silent, his hand still resting on his revolver, his face twisted into a grimace, as if the weight of Wyatt's words was finally sinking in. But then, with a sharp motion, Pike's hand flew to his holster, and before Wyatt could react, the sheriff had drawn his gun, pointing it squarely at Wyatt's chest. "You don't know anything," Pike spat. "You think you're some kind of hero, but all you've done is dig up old wounds that never should have seen the light of day." Wyatt's heart raced, but he didn't back down. His hand hovered over his own gun, ready but unwilling to draw first. He had come here to find the truth, and now, it seemed, he was about to confront it head-on. The two men stood there, locked in a tense standoff, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The sound of distant hooves echoed through the night air, but neither man shifted. Everything in the world seemed to be suspended, as if the fate of the town rested on what would happen in the next few moments. "Why?" Wyatt finally asked, his voice low, the question that had been gnawing at him for so long. "Why did you do it, Pike? Why bury everything? Why turn your back on the people who trusted you?" Pike's eyes flashed, a flicker of something regret, fear, or maybe even guilt crossing his face for just a moment. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He sneered, tightening his grip on the gun. It was never about them, Blackthorn. It was about power, survival. The town would have burned itself to the ground without me. And you're just another fool who's come to shake it all up. The sheriff's voice was steady now, cold, as he took a step forward. "You think you've uncovered the truth, but the truth is, it's already been decided, and you're too late to change anything." Wyatt's pulse quickened, but his resolve only hardened. "The truth can't be buried forever. Pike, it'll come back, and it's coming for you." With that, Wyatt took a step back, reaching for the lantern he had found in the mine. He held it up, the faint light casting shadows over the scene in front of them. "I found this in the mine," he said quietly. "I don't know what it means yet, but it's a start. And I'll keep digging, no matter what you say. The town deserves to know what happened here. You can't stop it." Pike's eyes flickered for a moment, his expression shifting from cold to something darker, more dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he growled, "and you don't know what it'll cost you." The sheriff took another step toward Wyatt, his revolver still trained on him. But Wyatt didn't move. His grip on the lantern tightened, the metal cold against his palm. He knew what this moment meant. He was about to face down the man who had shaped Griffith's Crossing into what it was, a man who had buried the truth for so long that he didn't even remember who he had become. "I've come too far to back down now," Wyatt said, his voice steady. The wind picked up again, howling through the streets of the town, and for a moment, the silence was broken by the sound of a distant bell tolling. The town's past was calling, and no one could ignore it any longer. As the sheriff stepped closer, Wyatt's hand moved to his holster. The cold metal of his gun felt like a weight he had carried for years. He was ready, but before he could draw, a shout rang out from the darkness. "Pike, you need to come with me, now." The wind whispers through the tall grass at the edge of Griffith's Crossing, a sound like an old memory that never quite fades. In the distance, the last rays of twilight paint the sky in shades of gold and purple, a farewell to the day that once belonged to a town now forgotten by time. It's a town that has seen more than its fair share of misfortune, yet the quiet stillness that settles over it now carries with it a sense of something almost sacred, as if the land itself remembers the weight of its sins and the quiet moments of redemption that followed. The wildflowers that grow in patches along the dirt roads may have sprung from broken earth, but they stand now as a testament to the human heart's capacity to heal. Even in the harshest of places, horses still pass by, their hooves clattering against the earth, carrying with them the weight of 1,000 untold stories, some of which have finally been revealed, and some that will never be known. There's a lingering sadness in the air. Yes, but also a quiet kind of peace, as if the soil itself has breathed a sigh of relief. The burdens of the past lifted, even just a little. You can almost hear the faint clink of a lantern being carried by someone who knows, someone who remembers, like an old medal, worn and faded, still holding some measure of its shine. The light flickers, soft, steady, a symbol that justice, though delayed, is still a flame that burns. The truth, too, is a flame, hidden in the shadows of broken lives, but it cannot stay hidden forever. The woman who waited, who survived, became a symbol of everything that was left unsaid in Griffith's Crossing. She was forgotten, perhaps, by all but those who knew the true cost of silence. But in her waiting, she became a beacon for all the lost things. The truth doesn't always need to be believed by many. Sometimes, it only takes one person to keep it alive, one soul to carry it through the years until others can see it too. A town that once lived in the shadow of its own lies is now, in its quiet way, starting to remember what it once forgot. The wildflowers bloom as the wind picks up once more, gentle as the memories that now float through the town, drifting across the streets like forgotten letters, old and worn, but still holding words that matter. Honor, buried for so long beneath dust and time, is never truly erased. It is only waiting for the right moment to rise again, like the sun setting behind the hills, casting its light on the things that matter. There's a finality in the night air. Yes, but there's also the faintest hope that it's never too late to begin again. The people of Griffith's Crossing. They've had their share of regrets. But who hasn't? It's what we do with them that defines us. Maybe the justice that came late wasn't as loud as it could have been, but it was still just as powerful. And in its silence, it spoke volumes. The forgotten woman's story was one of survival, yes, but also of a quiet kind of strength that saved more than just her own life. It saved a town, a generation of kindness that had been lost in the shuffle of too many hard years. The truth may have been buried, but it was never gone. It waited, as truths do, to be seen by the ones who needed it most. And in the end, it wasn't the town's silence that held sway, but the voices of those who chose to remember, to keep telling the stories, to make sure that even the quietest truths were heard. It's a lesson, slow and steady, like the wind through the branches of the old trees, that justice may take its time, but it's never too late to begin right where you are. So, if you still believe in honor, in the quiet power of redemption, and in the kind of forgiveness that takes root like wildflowers after the rain, then let this story be a reminder. Remember that it's never too late to make things right, to stand in the face of silence and speak out. If this tale has spoken to you, if it has stirred something deep within, leave a sign. Type 1, show your belief in the power of the past to shape the future. Join us in the Mar, Western Story Chronicles. For there are more tales yet to be told, stories that, like the wind, will carry on forever.